Hello students, welcome to your Friday assignment. So your Friday assignments for humanities is 10 minutes on Membean, and then you are to complete this assignment, Puerto Rico, and after you get done you are to turn this in on UC once completed. So the assignment is called Puerto Rican History and Viewpoints. Step 1 says read this article from the National Geographic and use it to create a timeline below. We have completed the first one for you as a model. For each date, you should include a short description of U.S.-Puerto Rico relations at the time. Things to consider for your description. Do Puerto Ricans have U.S. citizenship rights at this time? Are Puerto Ricans required to follow U.S. laws? And if so, what laws? Okay, so if we look at your chart here, starts off with 1898 right here, and this one is done for you. So it says the USA, which occupied Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War, takes control of the colony. Puerto Ricans are not citizens of the US at this point. So as we read the article from National Geographic, you are going to be looking for these dates: 1917, 1940, 1950, 1952, and then 2017 to present. All right, so I'm going to scroll up to the article. You should click on the article so you have it in front of you. So just a reminder, I'm gonna write the dates at the top of the screen here so you will know what you're looking for as we read. So if you need to pause excuse me, so if you need to pause the video as I read it to write down the events that happened for that year, do that. That'll probably be helpful rather than having to go back and forth for that. So the dates were 1917, 1940, 1950, 1952, sorry about all the scrolling, 1952, and then, 2017 to present, which is what the P stands for. All right, so it says, why Puerto Rico has debated U.S. statehood since its colonization. This territory in the Caribbean has been fighting for autonomy and full citizenship rights for more than a century. So this word autonomy you might not know, so you might want to go look that up and see what that means. Just remember those skills that we learned in transitions on Tuesday. To be a good reading comprehension, to be good at reading comprehension, you have to go look up those words that you don't know. So autonomy might be a good one, and just in case you want to know what it means like the right to self-govern. So Puerto Ricans want to govern themselves and not have another country ruling them. All right, so it says located about 1,000 miles from Florida in the Caribbean Sea, Puerto Rico is a United States territory, but it's not a state. U.S. citizens who reside on the island are subject to federal laws, but can't vote in presidential elections. So that might be the first bit that you should highlight here. Why? The answer lies in the island's long colonial history, one that arguably continues to this day. Puerto Rico had been a Spanish colony since the 16th century, but hundreds of years of repression, taxation, and poverty took their toll. By the 19th century, an independence movement sprang up on the island. Though Spanish forces quickly quelled an armed insurrection in 1868, the country tried to diffuse tensions by allowing the island more independence. But a few decades of relative autonomy came to a halt in 1898 when the United States declared war on Spain, ostensibly to liberate Cuba from colonial rule. On July 25, 1898, U.S. forces invaded Puerto Rico and occupied it during the ensuing months of the Spanish-American War. As part of the peace treaty in December 1898, the colony was transferred to the U.S. and a military government took over. Puerto Ricans continued to call for autonomy. In 1900, The Four-Acre Act established a civilian government but stopped short of conferring full rights on Puerto Ricans. As legal scholar Jose A. Cabranes explains, white American legislatures thought granting statehood to Puerto Rico would force the United States to admit the Philippines, which was another U.S. territory at the time, as well as endanger the interests of white laborers and farmers and increase racial mixing within the U.S. Instead, they granted Puerto Rico unorganized territory status and offered Puerto Ricans limited self-governance without U.S. citizenship. Next paragraph. Here's our first year that we're looking for. In 1917, that changed with the Jones-Shafroth Act, that's a tough word, seeking to address ongoing tensions on the island. Congress passed the law which gave most Puerto Ricans U.S. citizenship, but allowed the U.S. President and Congress to veto Puerto Rican laws. As citizens, Puerto Ricans also became subject to the newly enacted Selective Service Act, which led to the conscription, which means forced to fight in wars, of nearly 20,000 Puerto Rican men in World War I. So you might want to pause there and go back to your chart. Let's go down here to your chart, because 1917 is the next date here for you. So in your description, you are writing an answer to these two questions. Do Puerto Ricans have U.S. citizenship rights at this time? And then, are Puerto Ricans required to follow U.S. laws? And if so, what laws? So go back to that reading there of 1917 and reread that part and answer those questions in the table. But it wasn't until the Nationality Act of 1940. So I believe 1940 is your next date. Yes, it is. All right. Sorry about that. But it wasn't until the Nationality Act of 1940 that all people born in Puerto Rico were designated citizens by birthright, regardless of their parentage. All right. So this right here is 1940. Again, pause this, go down to your chart, fill in your answer, come back up and read. Then, in 1950, the United States gave the territory permission to draft its own constitution, provided it didn't change Puerto Rico's territorial status. In response, Puerto Rico held a constitutional convention establishing its own republican form of government and Bill of Rights. In 1952, Puerto Rico adopted the official name of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Sorry, I just kind of made that up. The Commonwealth of Puerto Rico and a new constitution. Since then, there's been an ongoing debate about what Commonwealth means. Some scholars and policymakers contend the term is mere moniker, as in the state names of Massachusetts or Pennsylvania. Others say it gives Puerto Rico a special status as a new kind of legal entity that renders it neither a territory nor a state. So here's our 1950. Here is the information for 1952. Either way, Puerto Ricans lack some of the key rights of mainland Americans. They send delegates to presidential nominating conventions, but they can't cast electoral votes in the general election, which means that their votes essentially don't count for presidency. They are subject to federal laws, but lack voting representation in Congress. Though the Puerto Rican delegate in the U.S. House of Representatives may serve on committees and introduce bills, they cannot vote. Meanwhile, residents of Puerto Rico do still contribute to Social Security and Medicare. But a contingent of scholars and policymakers believe that Puerto Ricans are not full citizens due to the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which declares that all people born or naturalized in the U.S. or subject to its jurisdiction are citizens. Since the territory isn't technically in the U.S., proponents of the constitutional theory believe Puerto Rican-born citizens aren't subject to the clause. Opponents say that while Puerto Rican-born citizens lack citizenship status on a constitutional basis, they received it on a statutory basis from the Nationality Act. So I don't know if you remember that. That's up here, the Nationality Act, which said that all people born in Puerto Rico were designated citizens by birthright, regardless of their parentage. So they were designated citizens of the U.S. because they were born in Puerto Rico. All right, I'm back here. Despite a modern statehood movement, which includes an attempt to gain recognition from Congress and an upcoming statehood referendum in November, it seems unlikely that Puerto Rico will become a state anytime soon. Here's your last year. In 2017, Morning Consult poll, only 54% of mainland Americans knew Puerto Ricans are American citizens, and the United States has resisted calls from the United Nations to fully decolonize its territory. Past voting on the subject of statehood has also been highly contested in Puerto Rico. The most recent poll in 2017 delivered a non-binding result that favored statehood, but turnout was just 23%, in a nation that averages about 80% turnout, and there were questions about the election's validity. The idea of statehood remains divisive in a territory that has long bristled at the decisions of the nation that claimed it in 1898. Puerto Ricans never asked to be colonized, never asked to be denied their Puerto Rican citizenship, and never asked to have U.S. citizenship imposed on them, writes legal professor Jacqueline N. Font Guzman from the Washington Post. They are colonial subjects of the United States. For Puerto Rico to become a state, it will need the support of U.S. citizens on the island and off. Until then, it will continue to be a little understood territory with a contentious history. All right, so that is the end of your reading for and about Puerto Rico. So remember, just continue on and fill in your chart here. After you fill in that chart, you will go to step 2, which says pick one of the years from your timeline and write from the perspective of a Puerto Rican from that year using these sentence starters. So, first thing that you have to do, the prompt says, I'm thinking from the viewpoint of a Puerto Rican from the year blank. So you're going to highlight one of these years, okay? Choose one of them. And then you're going to fill in the next table here with your response. So it says, I think, describe your topic from the viewpoint in several sentences. Be an actor, take on the character of your viewpoint, write from their perspective using I language. So if you are going to take the role of 1940, you're going to come back up here, you're going to find your 1940, which is right here, read it again, see what was going on in Puerto Rico in 1940, and then come back to your chart, and you're going to highlight viewpoint, what was going on in Puerto Rico at the time. Like it's a perspective of Puerto Rican from that year, okay? And then down here, you're going to ask a question that you have from this viewpoint. So again, same year, you're making sure to write a question that you may have from that year. So like, if you're doing 1940 talked about that Nationality Act, you might have a question about that. Or if you are pretending to be from 1917, you may want to have a question about the Selective Service Act. I don't know. It's totally up to you. 1950, we saw that they started to draft their own constitution. So you may take the role as a person who helped draft the Constitution. So those are the things that you have to think about when you're filling in this last chart. All right, as always, if you have questions, please email me. And when you get done with this assignment, make sure you submit it on UC to Group A Puerto Rico. See you later.